Tonight, we are very excited to welcome Andréa Becker. Andréa is the Assistant Professor of Sociology at Hunter College-CUNY.
Yeah,
CUNY. We had this whole discussion about it. Their writing has appeared in the New York Times, The Nation, and Slate. Andréa received their PhD in sociology from the CUNY Graduate Center and a master's from Vanderbilt University. After Andréa presents on their book, they'll be joined in discussion by Caine Jordan. Caine is a teaching fellow in the social sciences, race, diaspora, and indigeneity, who specializes in the history of medicine and African American history, focusing on African American physicians in the Jim Crow North. His first project examines obstacles to their professional advancement, their development, and the use of counter-institutions for professional and patient advocacy, and their creation of public health outfits for the distribution of care to disadvantaged communities. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Andréa. Up here in the front too, so if people want to either scoot down, that would be awesome.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for braving the cold. I really appreciate you being here, and thank you to Bonnie and Tate for making it happen. I'm Andréa Becker, and today I'll be presenting on my book, Get It Out, which came out this past summer with NYU Press. So first, to contextualize my work a bit more broadly, so I am a medical sociologist and I study public health issues at the nexus of gender and technology. And in particular, I look at what I call contested medical practices. So these are elements of medicine or health that are imbued with cultural, like polarizing cultural meanings, and the ways that they contribute to social and health inequality. And so as part of this study, I focus on reproductive health care, because reproductive health tends to be used as symbolic battlegrounds in which we contest broader cultural values surrounding the role of medicine and technology, gender, race, citizenship, and the family. So when we argue about things like abortion or IVF, we're really arguing about these broader cultural values. So the contested medical practice I focus on today is hysterectomy. And hysterectomy is the most common gynecological surgery worldwide. In fact, 1 out of 5 Americans who are assigned female at birth will have a hysterectomy by the age of 65. Every year in the US, there's 600,000 hysterectomies performed. So this comes out to more than 1 uterus per every minute of the year. And despite how common they are, we have very little social scientific research on it, particularly in sociology. So this leaves us with a lot of gaps in our knowledge, and a lot of the dominant claims and narratives about hysterectomy go unchallenged. So what are these dominant claims? Dominant narratives around hysterectomy tend to focus on the procedure as this ruinous life event, as something that happens to you, is chosen for you, and it's consistently linked in the social imagination with oppressive medical overreach and female suffering. So when we read about hysterectomy in the news, we typically read about disaster, about multiple events going wrong that led to a hysterectomy. So a emergency life-saving hysterectomy after denied abortion care, emergency hysterectomy on the battlefield in Gaza, and forced hysterectomies in ICE detention centers performed on migrant women who could not consent. And then when you do a Google search for hysterectomy book, the following results come up. The hysterectomy hoax, the truth about why many hysterectomies are unnecessary and how to avoid them. The castrated woman, what your doctor won't tell you about hysterectomy. You don't need a hysterectomy, new and effective ways of avoiding major surgery. And the only book in my field of sociology that devotes solely to hysterectomy is called Am I Still a Woman? So, as we can see, we needed some updating within sociology, and the narrative tends to be overwhelmingly negative. And so for my book, I wondered, how might the stories we tell about hysterectomy actually vary when you take a closer look through the eyes of those who have one and perhaps those who want one? So for the rest of the talk, I'll go over background and theory, a little bit of data and methods, key findings and implications. I was told to give a short lecture, so we might have to leave some stuff for the Q&A. A little quick history lesson. So tracing the history of hysterectomy in many ways gleans the history of the development of modern medicine and how it developed through time and transformed. So hysterectomies go back to at least 50 BC, but in terms of early modern hysterectomies, throughout the early 1800s, these were largely experimental procedures performed without anesthesia or antisepsis. We can see they're in these large halls where, a bunch of men without masks or gloves are watching. So these were really brutal events. They had really high rates of complications. The mortality rate lingered around 70%, even late into the 19th century. So they were largely considered a final plea for terminally ill women. But as surgery refined and developed, so did hysterectomy. And in particular, hysterectomy reached a turning point in 1988 when the first laparoscopic one was performed in Pennsylvania. So rather than this large cross-body incision, the modern hysterectomy is laparoscopic, meaning it's performed with keyhole incisions, so 3 to 5 tiny keyhole incisions. This leaves minimal scarring and typically low rates of complications. They're often considered minimally invasive, and many can leave the hospital the same day. So my research is motivated by the question of how this refinement of technology around hysterectomy might have changed the meaning of it and the way that it's used. So at the same time, while we're looking at the history, we have to examine how the US has long been a site of unequal reproductive health politics. And I argue that all reproductive health practices must be examined amid broader racialization projects. So to start, there was a substantial eugenics movement in the mid-20th century, throughout the 20th century really, during which predominantly low-income Black, Latina, Chicana, and indigenous women were forcibly sterilized in a way that sometimes implicated the hysterectomy directly. And this history and eugenics logic continues to cast a shadow in the practice of medicine in the United States and elsewhere. So it's a fool's errand to study hysterectomy without also analyzing the way this procedure has historically and continues to hinge on racialization, citizenship status, anti-Blackness, as well as social class. So before I go further, I want to make sure we all know what a hysterectomy is. You'd be surprised how many people don't know what I'm talking about. So as you probably know, it's the removal of the uterus, but it can also, but doesn't necessarily also involve the removal of the ovaries, fallopian tube, and the cervix. So because of those transformations of the technology, the vast majority of hysterectomies are deemed quote unquote elective, which you'll understand why I put it in quotes. So the majority are performed for the management of chronic illness in these organs, so anything like adenomyosis, endometriosis, or fibroids, or my favorite, unexplained irregular bleeding. I should note that it's not a full cure for endometriosis, but it has been shown to provide substantial relief. And it's also deemed an essential part of transgender healthcare by the WPATH. And this is deemed as such for a couple of reasons. So first is to cease menstruation and the capacity for pregnancy, both of which could lead to gender dysphoria. It can also eliminate OBGYN visits if the cervix is removed, so that's another source of dysphoria or even medical transphobia. And this one's a little more contested in the research, but some doctors believe that there is an increased cancer risk associated with long-term use of testosterone during hormone replacement therapy. And so it's seen as a preventative measure in those cases. In terms of the rates of hysterectomy, it's performed at higher rates in the US compared to Western Europe and Australia, but it varies by both race and place. So it continues to be overperformed among Black and Afro-Latina women in the US, and it's performed at higher rates in the South and the Midwest relative to other regions of the country. So my work also looks into why that is. And in terms of my theoretical frameworks, I approach this work from a feminist science and technology studies. So what this allows us to do is examine the ways culture shapes biology. So what we understand as biological facts in feminist STS, we examine how these biological facts are actually filtered through gendered and racial lenses. So anywhere from even something as simple or fundamental as how sperm and ovum meet during human conception, that is understood to be also a narrative that is filtered through gendered and heteronormative lenses, actually. And so feminist SCS also allows us to look at how culture influences reproductive health care, how gender, race, and class impact the provision of care. So who will get their IUD removed, who is given a C-section, and which abortions are considered legitimate. It also influences the experience of medicine. So things like the symptoms we associate with PMS, menopause, even contraception and IVF really hinge upon your race and class status as well. And so for my book, I look at how culture shapes hysterectomy experiences, and in particular, who is able to get a hysterectomy and who doesn't. And oftentimes it's for social reasons rather than solely medical or biomedical reasons. And then I also challenge central claims within medical sociology through my focus on medicalization. So medicalization is the process by which human traits, behaviors, and problems come to be defined and treated as medical problems. And the vast majority of work on medicalization, particularly early work on this field, looks at the negative aspects of medicalization. So how medicalization is a locus of social control by capital M medicine. But when you look at communities that have been underserved or overlooked by the institution of medicine, it begins to look more complicated. And there's this tension between over-medicalization and under-medicalization. And hysterectomy explicates this tension. So there's very limited research, diagnostic technologies, and treatments for uterus-related ailments. So there's an under-medicalization there. And these are communities largely left behind by medicine. So there's so many gaps in medical scholarship on women's health, on trans health, on chronic illness, and so on and so forth. And then my work also fits into the politics of reproduction. So we think of reproduction as this biological process. Sociologists understand that it's social as well. And in particular, the degree of freedom we have to make reproductive choices hinges on who you are, where you live, and the resources at your disposal. So this is the case for, access to birth control or fertility promoting technologies like egg freezing, and also with hysterectomy. And so I also contribute and am inspired by reproductive justice. And this is a framework that moves beyond the right to choose not to be pregnant to also the right to be pregnant and to raise children safely. And hysterectomy contributes to this by examining both sides of eugenics. They're referred to by Dorothy Roberts as positive and negative eugenics. So negative eugenics is typically what we think of. So it's the reduction of births. And this looks like poor and women of color being encouraged towards long-acting reversible contraception or permanent sterilization like hysterectomy, while white and affluent women are encouraged towards new reproductive technologies. So those are the two sides of eugenics that feed and inform each other. Okay. And so we land with hysterectomy as a critical case that combines all of these various reproductive, gendered, and racialized discourses. So I ask, how do biological, cultural, and structural factors interact to shape contemporary experiences with elective hysterectomy? And more broadly, what can hysterectomy narratives explicate about broader inequalities at the nexus of medicine, race, and gender? Okay. So I have various chapters, but I'm going to focus on these two. Okay, and then very briefly, so I sought to answer my research questions through 100 remote interviews with people who had, want, or have sought an elective hysterectomy. And I drew upon two comparative cases. So the first was people for whom a hysterectomy was a treatment or management of a chronic reproductive illness. And the other was hysterectomy as part of gender-affirming care. I intentionally sought a diverse sample in terms of race, gender, sexual orientation, age, and location, and I recruited primarily digitally. These were some of my flyers that I distributed digitally. And this was during the pandemic, so it was initially going to be in person, but okay. And in terms of who I ended up speaking with, it was almost evenly split between the two cases. So 46 trans or non-binary people and 54 cis women. Some of the trans and non-binary people also had a chronic illness, so they fit in within both. And the age ranged from 20 to 62 with an average of 34. And I sought to create a racially diverse sample. Okay, so finally, what I found. Okay, so counter to these dominant narratives about hysterectomy as an overperformed tool of medical oppression and hyster-happy doctors that happens to you, people in my study oftentimes spoke about hysterectomy as something that they themselves choose or want to choose as a way to take care of themselves or to achieve health and embodied goals. And this was really encapsulated by Lee. So Lee is a 29-year-old white non-binary person living in Arizona, and they told me, I didn't go into it thinking I'll have a hysterectomy and I'll be cured. I have a chronic illness and I'm still trying to figure out my body right now. But just the idea that I could have a hysterectomy felt like a tool in my toolbox, and to not utilize it would be detrimental to myself. And if you have a tool, why not use it? So you see this begins to turn dominant understandings of hysterectomy on its head. The idea that you would want to use this tool, that it's something at your disposal to help you. But the particular ways that it was a tool depended on which of the two case studies it was in. So some people spoke about a hysterectomy as a way to fix a defective uterus or broken body, and then trans and non-binary people tended to talk about it as a tool for getting rid of a pesky or extraneous organ. So for the first, individuals drew upon a wide range of metaphors to describe their broken or defective uterus or body. In these cases, the uterus often caused extreme pain and bleeding, as well as often infertility. So for instance, Yerma, after years of adenomyosis and endometriosis and a series of miscarriages, they finally had a hysterectomy. And this is how they described it to me. Doctors told me a lot of horrible things about hysterectomy, but for me it was immediate relief. I had a messed up, totally Swiss cheese uterus. It had to go. It was not a working organ. It was a broken organ, but it's amazing how people don't want you to take it out. Hysterectomy allowed me to go back to work because I didn't have this intense pain or bleeding all of the time that caused severe blood loss and anemia. Other people talked about it like a broken window in your car that doesn't go down anymore and you're not using it. So these various metaphors for brokenness, something that needed to be fixed. And then trans and non-binary people who didn't have a chronic illness tended to talk about the uterus as something that wasn't meant to be there in the first place, that was there by accident. And so for Mac, he is a 26-year-old white trans man, and he told me, well, I didn't want to get pregnant. I didn't want to have an extra organ that I didn't really need. And I felt it was more symbolic of something that I wasn't. I'm very grateful that I had it removed, so I feel great. I never wanted it in the first place, and I call the hysterectomy the big scoop. And the big scoop solved all of that for me. So this idea of a hysterectomy being a solution to these various embodied or gendered goals. And many that I spoke to also directly referred to this refined technology. So Mati is a 53-year-old Latina woman living in California, and when she found out that a hysterectomy is laparoscopic, it seemed like a no-brainer to her. She said, okay, so you don't have to cut me open. And the doctor said, I don't think so unless there's a complication. So we set it up, and it was really easy, and I don't know why more people don't do it. I really don't. I personally don't understand if this causes so many problems. Why would we keep something that we are no longer going to use? However, the ability for people to choose this tool really hinged upon their gender and their race. So per their own words, their doctors' approach to the hysterectomy ranged from total refusal to stoic coercion to routine practice. So for refusal, this tended to be the experience of white women who were told you will regret it, it's too extreme, your future husband will be upset, even if there was no man in the picture, this invisible man, or you're too young, even well into their late 30s. So for Stacy, she is a 24-year-old white cis woman. And as a cure for hysterectomy, or as a cure for her endometriosis symptoms that she was experiencing, her doctor recommended she get pregnant to cure her symptoms. Pregnancy is not a cure for endometriosis, I should say, but this is what she told me. The doctor said, you could always give it up for adoption. You need your body to go through the process to help you. The pregnancy was prioritized for some reason. I felt a lot of pressure from the doctors that a hysterectomy was such an extreme choice for me to have at my age, yet the option of having a kid at 21 didn't seem as extreme to them. Likewise, Clara, a 27-year-old white woman living in Utah, felt that they were really wanting to preserve her fertility. The entire time I've been told, you're too young, let's do all this other stuff to treat the cysts and the endometriosis. That's all terrible. Why is my quality of life being pulled down? Because you're set on me having a kid one day. As a contrast, some patients experienced their doctors recommending a hysterectomy even well before they wanted one, and oftentimes verging on coercion. And this was more often the experience of Black and Afro-Latina women that I spoke to. So for Luna was the same age as Stacy, she was a college student living in a large city in the East Coast. And while Stacy was told she should get pregnant, Luna was told to get a hysterectomy. So they told me that I should get a hysterectomy, and I was like, I'm 20. And they were quite callous about it, very nonchalant. They're like, you need to get a hysterectomy. You're not going to be able to have children. Likewise, Kat, who did not want a hysterectomy, felt that it was constantly recommended to her throughout her life. She said, every time I had a physical exam, every time I had a vaginal exam, every time I had a pelvic exam, it was hysterectomy, hysterectomy, hysterectomy. It was definitely pushed. So we see how race shapes the way that a doctor approaches hysterectomy, the meaning of age, the meaning of fertility preservation. And then for trans and non-binary people, it was often suggested as a routine next step on their journey. So for instance, Sam was 19 at the time. Oftentimes it was, like for Sam, it was mentioned and fertility wasn't even part of the conversation. Fertility preservation didn't come up, even though, they were as young or even younger than Stacy and Luna was. It was a suggestion from my doctor, actually. I was sort of asking him in the appointment about birth control, and he said, why not just get a hysterectomy? It seems like you don't really need it for much. And I thought, yeah, that's probably true. I probably am not going to use my uterus at all. So he ended up getting a hysterectomy at 19. And so in turn, the way that the doctor presents a hysterectomy shapes the patient experience as well. And so while we tend to talk about hysterectomy as universally leading to grief and regret, I found a wider range. So some definitely experience grief and regret, but others experience delight. They talk about it as the best thing that they've done for themselves. And then other people feel neutral about it altogether, talking about it like like just any other medical experience, like a flu shot or fixing a broken bone. So for delight, this tended to be the experience of people who fought for hysterectomy, who wanted one for years and weren't listened to. So for instance, Angelica, she was in her 30s when she got a hysterectomy, and she told me, it was the best thing I ever did. My quality of life has improved 1,000%. My only regret is not being able to get it earlier. Likewise, Janet, 43, also never had kids, said, it was the best thing I ever did for myself. My uterus served a purpose, and I didn't end up using it for its intended purpose, so it didn't make me feel like less of a woman. However, for those that didn't feel like they chose a hysterectomy or that it was pushed on them, that's when feelings of grief and regret came in. And these stories are really, really heartbreaking. So for Tamara, she was 25 when she got a hysterectomy, and she lives in Georgia, and she was so upset by the hysterectomy that she told me she puts a sticky note on her mirror so that she looks at it and it says, you're worthy of being a woman, you're worthy of being a mom. So she told me, when the one thing that separates you from a man is taken away, it makes you question your identity. And when the role that's in question is being a woman and whether you're good enough to be seen as a woman, the answer is no, because you don't have a uterus. Similarly, Marisol said, in my Latino culture, as soon as I got married, they say, when are you having kids? They see you as there's something wrong with you. I hate feeling like I'm less of a woman because I can't carry a child for full term. And it's kind of like a man getting rid of his testicles, you know. How's a man going to feel? It's the same. So we see these very different experiences to the exact same procedure, and it tended to coincide with how their medical journey led to the hysterectomy. And then for many trans and non-binary people for whom a hysterectomy was just presented as the next step after, and typically it was presented after they've, you know, gone on testosterone for many years, had other surgeries, or, you know, had a name change, like they proved they were trans enough, quote unquote. So it was after a series of battles as well. But because it was presented as just a natural next step, they often experienced it in these neutral terms as well. So Daniel, who's a 28-year-old mixed-race trans man, told me, I guess I feel quite neutral. It's just a necessary medical procedure. Like if you have a broken arm, you say, okay, I'm glad my arm is no longer broken. I had surgery to fix that. It's kind of like a neutral feeling. Another guy told me it felt like getting his flu shot. He wasn't excited about getting his flu shot, but he'll get it if he really needs it. So of course, some people do experience gender euphoria from it, but the most neutral experiences that I found tended to be from the trans participants that I spoke to. Okay, so to sum it all up, my book tells a tale of 3 hysterectomies and 3 very different journeys towards hysterectomies depending on both gender and race. And so this tells us that the biological experience of hysterectomy is shaped by culture and social inequality. And this is both in terms of the provision of a hysterectomy as well as the patient experience. This also tells us that historically oppressive medical tools can be reclaimed and reappropriated to fit new culturally informed biomedical needs. So in the case of hysterectomy, the technological refinement coupled with a broader gendered social change transformed the meaning of hysterectomy for many people. This allowed hysterectomy to emerge as a form of self-care or bodily enhancement or forging a new identity. So these things were not possible in prior years. This also tells us that experiences with sterilization procedures and infertility vary. So we tend to only talk about the negative aspects of sterilization or being infertile, but my book complicates this more because you can choose infertility, you can choose sterilization as well. But the ability to feel delight or neutral about it depends on your positionality as well as your perceived agency or choice in getting to that point. And my book also explicates the 2 sides of eugenics logic. So both ushering women of color towards sterilization, but also barring white women from choosing sterilization. And both are 2 sides of eugenics logic that, again, reinforce one another. In terms of gender-affirming care, it's more of a complicated issue because, you know, they're choosing sterilization, but in a system of unequal access to healthcare and fertility preservation. And so amid this system, it's not fully a chosen option. So some key takeaways. First is that intersectionality is key in the study of health and reproduction because race, gender, and sexual orientation shape our experiences and our attitudes. And the history and social context behind a medical procedure really matter. They hold different weight for different communities. You know, different people have varying stories about these procedures in their families. And so these histories and these contexts really matter to how a patient will experience it. And hysterectomy also illustrates how all reproductive choices, whether it's abortion, IVF, birth control, or hysterectomy, are constrained by these interlocking systems of inequality. So, and this is a really key analytic lens as we continue to see the reduction and the attacks of reproductive freedoms in trans healthcare in this second Trump presidency. So thank you to my funding sources and my wonderful research participants, and thank you all for listening. Oh, yeah.
The chat.
I guess you're asking me questions then.
Oh. First of all, thank you for this amazing talk. So I had a couple of questions and then we'll open it up because there's so many people here. Thank you for coming.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so the first is just that, this book was obviously written prior to our current political moment. And you sort of gesture towards a second Trump presidency in the book, where you talk about the possibility of a national abortion ban and further restrictions on abortion modifications, etc. Could you tell us more about how your work speaks to the current moment?
Yeah. Well, first I should say we don't have a national abortion ban.
Right.
So,
yeah.
But yeah, so it speaks to the current moment in various ways. So first, the continuous attack on trans healthcare. They started, with trans children and trying to reduce access to trans healthcare for children, calling it child abuse in certain states, coming after doctors and their parents. So creating this chilling effect for trans people to be able to get the care that they need and that we know has significant health benefits, especially mental health benefits. And so my book, explains the various reasons why someone gets gender affirming care, the various benefits of it that are often overlooked by, collecting all of these various stories. And then, before this, I was primarily an abortion researcher, so I've done a lot of research on abortion. And the reason I am interested in abortion, well, one of the reasons is because, we like the different metaphors that are embedded in these social arguments around it. And I figured if we have so many moral panics around the termination of one pregnancy, what could it mean to terminate the capacity for all pregnancy? So I figured it was an extension of these discourses that I wanted to dig into. And I really found that we weren't talking about hysterectomy at all. So I go to reproductive conferences, at least 2 a year, and hysterectomy was never really discussed. I didn't even know how common it was. So it was 1 in 3 when I started my research. Now it's 1 in 5. But so I was just shocked that I didn't know how common it was. So I guess I answered your question.
Yeah. No, it was when I was thinking about sort of the current moment and sort of abortion bans, I was thinking about the Comstock Act and how that could potentially, very concerning.
Well, because I didn't even answer your question.
No, it's great. And another question is just, I thought in the book, first of all, the book is very easy to read and also academic, which is just a very difficult thing to balance as if you're in gender sexuality studies, But I did have a question about sort of balancing all of this, which you did very well. So how difficult was it to balance all of these different experiences and stories, within the book?
Yeah, it is. Since there's so much going on, it was difficult to bring it into a cohesive narrative. Even for a 30-minute presentation, it's difficult. But I wanted to be able to make comparisons across race and gender. It was really important for me to have those comparative cases. So it was worth it to me to make it more complex for how am I going to fit this all in one chapter. Ultimately, I think, if I only did it by race and class, or if I didn't include the trans and non-binary people, it would not be as strong of a book and it wouldn't be telling the same story. Because I can make arguments that hysterectomy is gendered and that the way that professionals approach hysterectomy is gendered. I could say that, but when I'm comparing it to another gender, it's the same organ, right? But it's a cis woman versus a trans man versus a non-binary person. Same organ, but a different gendered body. And that fully changes the equation that a doctor is working on. And so that to me it was important for me to be able to include that.
Absolutely. And I do have other questions, but I do want to open it up also to the audience. So if anyone has a question, I'll try to keep track.
Pain half the year, or bleeding excessively all of the time, or you're not able to have sex, or it's interfering with your ability to go to work or school, it's still considered elective. And so this gets into the way that we think about disability as well, and the way that we think about women's pain. That's a big one. And so a lot of the book talks about this devaluing or like overlooking of women's pain. So, we've known about endometriosis since like over 100 years, and we can still only really fully diagnose it through surgery, which is ridiculous to me. Like, why haven't we looked into this further? We don't have cures for it. And so it gets into disability and what we consider, like life-saving or worthy of intervention, but also whose pain we consider important, and when, who is deserving of treatment. And then a lot of the people I spoke to said, like they're technically disabled, but they have difficulty claiming this term, and this is part of those, because of those discourses, because we think that if you have a uterus, your life is full of pain, then they don't feel comfortable like claiming that disability identity, even though legally speaking they have a disability. So yeah, good question.
Wait, back there. Yes, what's your name?
Hi, I'm Lucas.
Hi.
I was curious about your section. You have like the 3 parts where you specifically highlighted like transgender folk being under like this section of like routine practice, and I was just curious if you could shed a little bit of light on that. I'm curious why, sorry, I have 2 questions. First, I'm wondering like, did you get a lot of other descriptions from trans people, like specifically about like their experiences, or like was the very common thread that it was like a routine practice? And then to more specify that, like did you notice any differences between the like gender non-conforming, non-binary folk and like the like binarized like trans men? Did you notice differences in their answers?
Yes, absolutely. Okay, so to both. First one. Oh, yeah, so I focused on the neutrality one because I was surprised by how many people were talking about it in neutral terms, right? So I was expecting, gender euphoria to be like a more salient theme. But what I found, and to make it a little bit more precise, is that they were recommended it as a routine practice, like if they wanted a phalloplasty, hysterectomy is a necessary first step. Or, if they're told that they have a heightened risk of cancer, then it's this preventative surgery. And so it was like not engendered reasons necessarily, but then a lot of the people I spoke to said they didn't expect it to be gender affirming, but then afterwards they were really happy to not have a uterus. Or like once they realized they could never get pregnant, they were really happy about it. So it was a little more complicated than that, so I'm glad you're asking that. And then in terms of non-binary or non-conforming versus trans men, there was definitely a difference. So the further you go from embodying a cis woman, the easier it gets to get a hysterectomy. And so for, there's these really, it's transnormativity in medicine, so a lot of doctors are not trained in non-binary identities or non-binary medicine. They expect someone to follow these routinized steps and to have the same like narrative about themselves as a child, so on and so forth. And so if they vary from that narrative, then doctors, might not take them seriously. And so some people I spoke to, if they were non-binary and didn't want top surgery or didn't want to go on testosterone, their doctor didn't see them as quote-unquote trans enough. And so some people I spoke to said they ended up having to go through the route of like saying they have fibroids or some other chronic issue because they weren't able to get one for gender-affirming care. Or one person uses they/them pronouns, but their doctor assumed they were a trans man and they just went with it to like make it easier. So there's a lot of stories like that where they knew what their doctor wanted them to say, and so they would say that.
Oh. Yes.
Hello, I'm an undergraduate student. I'm currently on the pre-med track. Thank you for the talk, by the way. It was really interesting content. So I know you mentioned earlier about this process of medicalization that happened, especially in American society, and I had a question about that. So I think it's really interesting. I was taking a couple of quotes from your slides, and one of the individuals who was neutral about their feeling of hysterectomies, they described it as if you they compared it to having a broken arm, right? And just if you have a broken arm, it's you're sick and you need a procedure or you need a drug or you need something to fix that part of the body. So I'm really curious, do you see this very biomedical perspective of illness in certain populations more than others? And not every single culture embodies the biomedical model of illness to the same extent. So do you see differences in like perceptions on hysterectomies or other procedures in those communities?
Oh, that's a really thoughtful question. I mean, there's definitely differences in how people talk about them, but I did find, so I didn't get to put a slide about biomedicalization that I think is more apt. Do you guys know about that? So biomedicalization refers to this like transformation of medicine. So the way that medicine used to be solely to prevent immediate death or to cure disease, but now because we have so much technology and this like broader commodity culture, we can use medicine and medical technologies to achieve broader goals, like, you know, to forge a new identity, to enhance your body, to reduce risk. And so overwhelmingly, I heard people talking about hysterectomy through this biomedicalization lens. So of like a tool in the toolbox, of something they can use for themselves. So they might not think about it in like a traditional way. They might, so I talked a bit about DIY health in the book. So there's a move towards doing things, you know, at home births, or, you know, home abortions. But with a hysterectomy, you can't do it at home. So you have to use the medical system to work for you. And so one of the chapters in the book is about how the strategies people use to get to a hysterectomy. And so they understand, I call it the rowdy patient, where they understand they have to use certain scripts, or they have to, you know, follow certain strategies to navigate a healthcare system to end up at this goal that they want. So I hope that gets at your question. There was a lot happening, but I think overall it was something that I can use for myself.
Can you also talk about sort of the limitation of sort of of research that has basically the sort of very limited scope of, you know, sort of moving only sort of talking about and researching mainly fertility and infertility, etc., versus versus some of these other issues that women face?
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, this is probably way lower now, but 10% of the NIH annual budget went towards studying women's issues or women's healthcare. And within that, 80% of that was to study things like childbirth and pregnancy. So that leaves 2% of the annual budget for anything related to quote unquote women's healthcare that has nothing to do with childbirth and pregnancy. And so overwhelmingly, the medical system centers fertility and fertility promotion, and we see this bias coming through in the hysterectomy narratives. And even with endometriosis, so it takes 7 to 10 years on average to get diagnosed with it if you're just saying, I have pain and bleeding. But if you are having infertility issues, the average time goes down, because then doctors are invested in finding the root of your infertility, and then endometriosis is diagnosed. So if anyone's interested in that, I would encourage you to read Miranda Wagner's book on the 0 trimester. And it gets into how all women and girls are looked at one-day mothers, their bodies as one-day pregnant, and this bias, you see it, like once you are attuned to it, it's everywhere in medicine, and in public health campaigns, the way doctors talk to teenage girls, and so forth.
And sort of like on that, do you think that also sort of limits the tools in the toolbox, so to speak, that your participants are able to?
Yeah, because people ask me, you know, is this a pro or anti-hysterectomy book? But it's neither. You know, because, you know, a hysterectomy can bring a lot of relief, but it's often the catch-all solution to like 12 different problems. So, you know, that's what's complicated and, you know, problematic about a hysterectomy is, you know, it's a constrained choice, because if you had other alternatives besides a hysterectomy, would someone be choosing it? And we don't know, because we don't have those alternatives, right?
I think yes. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you for the talk. I was at the book. I was very impressed by the book. I'm Caine. I'm a postdoc at the Data Science Institute.
Thank you.
My question the part that was actually one of the parts that I was most impressed by was actually your data collection, because I feel like you collected a very wide and diverse sample that I rarely see. So I was wondering, and where, especially where like certain minority groups are almost like overrepresented compared to the population proportions. So I was wondering, could you just speak a little bit more about how you like made this happen?
Yeah. Thank you for saying that, because someone on Goodreads said the opposite. So. You're wrong. Yeah, so a lot of sociology of reproduction work, if you look at it, they're only talking to white women.
Yeah.
And so a lot of the theories and frameworks we have really only apply to white women. And if I only talk to white women, it'd be a completely different book. So first, when I was proposing it to the IRB, the Institutional Review Board, they told me, you're not going to find 100 people, it's impossible, like, you should lower it. But then I found that, people really wanted to talk about their hysterectomy. They had never had this opportunity. So I ended up having to turn people away at one point. But at first it was a lot of white women wanted to talk to me. Yeah. So I'm glad that I set up limits. I thought about it at the beginning, how many do I need in each box to be able to have meaningful amount of data to make comparisons. So I thought of that in the first place. So once I reached a certain number of white cis women, I said, no more. And then their stories were really valuable, but so then I ended up looking on Instagram and Facebook. So there's a lot of online communities around these issues. There's Endo Black. They were really helpful. So they consist of Black women who have endometriosis and share their stories on Instagram and Facebook. And I spoke to a lot of them. And then I created a flyer that specifically said I wanted to talk to women of color, so that helped. And then I also made a flyer that specifically said I wanted to talk to trans and non-binary people, so that I could get more of them. So it took multiple iterations. I think it was almost 2 years of data collection, so it took a really long time. But thankfully, people were really bored during the pandemic, so they wanted to talk. That helped.
Yeah, my name's Asher. I'm a pre-med student. I was wondering, because you mentioned that there's a history of both doctors kind of over-recommending and under-recommending hysterectomy as a solution, do you have any insights on what the medical establishment could do to help doctors more recommended the correct amount, kind of hit that sweet spot of not being too pushy for it and not restricting it too much?
Patient-centered care, number one thing. So I think what's happening oftentimes is this overcorrection. So we know that there were, forced sterilization campaigns, formal eugenics boards in so many states. And because of that, they want to prevent sterilization in many ways. And so, I heard stories one woman in Massachusetts wanted to get a hysterectomy. She has adenomyosis, so that's the only cure for it. And that's counter to it. So for endo, it's not a full cure, but for adenomyosis, it is. And her doctor told her, this is your only solution, but the hospital doesn't do that. They won't give a hysterectomy for someone in their 20s, but maybe you should go to the South and it'll be easier for you. So, he acknowledged that different hospital systems and different regions of the country have different orientations towards this procedure, towards sterilization practices. And it necessitates this, medical tourism that not everyone can do. Not everyone can fly to Georgia to get a hysterectomy and spend a week there or whatever. And so, I think some sort of understanding that people can choose sterilization, people can opt into infertility, that when they're choosing between, having these organs and living a life free of pain, then infertility doesn't seem that bad. The calculus is different. So just a more nuanced understanding of how people feel about infertility and, how sterilization procedures vary in experiences. So again, patient-centered care, more of that.
So, and then, go ahead.
Hi, my name is V. I'm a medical student here in first year. Thank you again for your presentation. It was extremely informative.
Thank you.
I think Lucas, was it, that asked a question earlier about gender presentation and how
Yeah.
that kind of impacted access to hysterectomies and how that was part of transition care, kind of more routine thing. But we also have this story about racialization and how eugenics has played out for different races. And I was kind of wondering, because you had such a diverse sample size, were you able to see a difference among gender diverse patients in regard to presentation and race, and seeing if those two kind of played into their access to hysterectomy as well?
For this group, I didn't see race really coming into play in the same way. So I was surprised with, like, among women, it was so stark that the race was really shaping their pathway towards hysterectomy. But for trans and non-binary people, it didn't seem to come into play. So I had a couple quotes that showed this, but of just like the agency and bodily autonomy that was granted to them was interesting. So, but one reason it's more complicated is because a lot of trans and non-binary people go to specific clinics that are oriented towards this, and so they're trained in bodily autonomy, right? Or they're more attuned to patient choice around bodily autonomy. And so that makes it a little more complicated, whereas, you know, women might be going to just a general doctor that isn't a specialist or isn't, you know, doesn't have a sociology degree or something like that. So there is that difference in just the context of where they are. So that could be what's coming into play for sure. And then one interesting thing I found was that some of the trans and non-binary people of color that I spoke to learned about hysterectomy because they learned about forced sterilization in these communities and then thought, wait, I want that. You can get that? So it was this like complicated thing where they learned about it as this oppressive tool and that made them want to get a hysterectomy. Yeah. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Abby. I'm like a third year at the undergrad. I'm an undergrad. And I have like two questions. So if there's like short on time, just feel free to answer one. How did you account for like disproportionate, like we've been talking about it, like how it's been affecting different races differently. So how did you account other than like the posters for that disproportionate, like black women are like the highest, like are twice more likely to be recommended a hysterectomy, and even like the idea that like Hispanic adults have below basic like health literacy, and then like how did that those factors, and also just like the idea that it might just be really traumatic for like these populations to talk about it, especially if it was coerced or if they have like these regretful feelings about it. Like, I guess how did you account for that and not let like the positive because it is important to keep the positive aspect to it, because it is like you're saying like a reclaimed like space of agency, but at the same time like shedding light on like the disparity in the medical practice. And then my second one is like, how did you approach these interviews, since they are like sensitive topics?
Yeah. Okay, so what was your first question?
How did you account for like this like, you know, women not wanting to talk about this, and like those women not wanting to talk about this more likely to be like African American women or Latino women who got like these hysterectomies, and like how did you include them in the study if like, you know, reaching out to them it would be hard, or having them come to you, like, you know, like the confounding variables of like representation. Yeah. Does that make sense? Sorry.
Yeah, definitely.
I can clarify more.
I mean, I did find that even people with really negative experiences wanted to talk about it. So because a lot of these things are taboo, they don't get to talk about it in their regular life. And so I think there was that element of it as well, that, you know, maybe they can't talk to people in their life about, you know, feeling like less of a woman or feeling like they were coerced. But if it's like this anonymous interview on Zoom with some random person they'll never see again, I think it's I think it made it more approachable for many people. So it's possible I didn't get to talk to people with like even worse experiences, that there's that limitation that, you know, they didn't want to talk about it, or they didn't want to talk about it with me. So that's possible. And, you know, if someone else did the study, I'm sure it could look different too. But I try to include both the negative and the positives. Yeah.
So, yes, and then, yeah, no, yes, go on.
Okay.
And then,
Nikki's had her hand up.
I think someone earlier asked first, thank you so much for the presentation.
Thanks for coming.
Very informative. But someone, you mentioned in the presentation.
Wait, what's your name?
Marissa.
Melissa. Okay.
Yeah. You mentioned that hysterectomies were more accessible in the South and Midwest. Do you know why that is, or I found that statistic to be relatively surprising?
I don't know exactly why, but I think as I mentioned before, the other places are overcorrecting. So like in California was implicated in the eugenics movement heavily.
Yeah.
For those that don't know, even Hitler was inspired by California's eugenics movement, and they had like regular communication, so that's how bad it was.
Yeah.
So I think there's like a concerted effort to reduce the number of hysterectomies, even if this means taking away bodily choice, bodily autonomy. And there's also something going on with Catholic hospitals. So a lot of hospitals in the US are secretly Catholic. We might not think they're Catholic. My colleague Lori Friedman has 2 books on it. I really recommend it. And so they might tell you something like, oh, we just don't do that here, or like this hospital doesn't do it, but they don't say it because we're Catholic. They just say like, so there's these definitely like all of these various levers where it might not happen. So your doctor might not think you should have one. The hospital might be the hospital system might be the ones barring it, or it could be your insurance. So your insurance system doesn't consider it medically necessary, won't cover it. So there are these various levers that could be greenlighting or barring access. So there's a lot happening. Yeah, a good question.
Hi, I'm Christina.
Hi.
I'm wondering, are tubal ligations a hysterectomy, or is that a separate thing altogether? And then my second question is the use of hysterectomies or tubal ligations in prisons or ICE centers. Do you know more about that?
Yeah, so they are different. I do find that people talk about them interchangeably. So it's interesting you bring that up. So a tubal ligation is the severing of the fallopian tubes. So everything stays in the body, but you can no longer get pregnant because the egg can't travel in the fallopian tube. Whereas the hysterectomy is removing at least the uterus. So they're both sterilization procedures, but a hysterectomy is considered more extreme since it's the permanent removal. And so even after you have a tubal ligation, in theory you could still get pregnant if you use IVF because the uterus is still there. So I think for that reason, a hysterectomy is considered even like more irreversible, more scary to these biases. And then in terms of, I only know about the allegations in the Georgia ICE detention centers where that whistleblower alleged that there was a doctor they nicknamed the uterus collector, which is really disgusting. But yeah, so that really displayed how like citizenship status also comes into play with like whose fertility is deemed worthy of preserving and promoting versus whose is more like discardable. And so we really, like I mentioned, a hysterectomy is this like catch-all solution to a million things. And so in these detention centers where a lot of these people can't consent if they don't speak if they don't speak English, they don't have like citizenship status, they're at this really, tenuous position in their lives that their doctor is like choosing this one solution for them. It becomes really problematic to say the least. And it happened, I used to compare that alongside Lena Dunham's hysterectomy because it happened around the same time. Do you guys know about this? So Lena Dunham, which you might know?
No. Yeah.
Have you heard of the show Girls? Usually people are like, yeah, Lena Dunham. And so Lena Dunham is this like really famous actor and director, and like around the same time as these allegations of the ICE detention centers forced hysterectomies, she wrote this Vogue story about her hysterectomy that she got. So she was 31, I want to say, and she camped out in the hospital for like 10 days, like demanding a hysterectomy before her doctor finally did like agree to it. And so there was this contrast there between this like rich, wealthy, celebrity white woman not being able to get a hysterectomy, like comparing it to those horrible stories in ICE detention centers really show the stratified reproduction there.
There's also a report from California of 2011, I think about over 100 women being forcibly
In prison.
Yeah,
Oh,
in
wow.
prison,
Yes.
forcibly sterilized.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. And then, yes.
Are we at time?
One more?
Yeah.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Olivia. I'm a history PhD student. Thank you for such an interesting talk. I was wondering if change over time was a variable you measured at all. It seemed like you talked to a lot of people of different generations. Did they get their hysterectomies sort of like at the same like time, like I don't know, decade, or was it like sort of a longer process? And like, did you see changes in like over time?
Yeah. I think some of the older women I spoke to, they had hysterectomies after they had multiple children. And so it was presented in this routine practice way of, well, you've already have kids, let's just take the whole thing out, let's get it out, which was in a different way. So that was the main difference I saw. So like, because they've already used their uterus and like did their fertility, fulfilled their fertility potential or whatever, then a hysterectomy was green lighted. So like Matty, that was her story, she had 3 kids. And for those that had it earlier on or like a longer time ago, those were less likely to preserve the ovaries. So some of the people I spoke to didn't know that they could keep their ovaries, and so they went into surgical menopause and like weren't really told that by their doctor. Whereas now I think there's more information that you can keep your ovaries to prevent surgical menopause, that more doctors are doing laparoscopic procedures versus, the cross-body incision ones.
Thank you so much, Andréa Becker.